Marisol was on her knees on cold stone, a linen napkin trembling in her hand, scrubbing champagne off the hem of a woman's gown while 200 guests in evening wear watched and said nothing. "People like you," Vanessa hissed down at her, "should be grateful you're even allowed to touch a room like this." What Vanessa didn't know, standing there in her perfect dress with her perfect smile cracking at the edges, was that the man she was about to marry had already seen everything. He'd been watching for weeks. And he was done pretending he hadn't. Before we get into tonight's story, take a second to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. This one gets heavier before it gets better, so stay with us all the way to the end, because what Julian Cross does next is going to surprise you. Let's go back 3 months, to before any of that happened. Before the dress, before the terrace, before 200 people went silent at the same time. The penthouse sat on the 51st floor of a glass tower overlooking Central Park, the kind of address that didn't need a street number spoken out loud because everyone who mattered already knew exactly where it was. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline like a painting that changed with every hour of the day. It was the kind of home most people only saw in magazine spreads. And somewhere in the quiet corners of those 12,000 square feet, a woman named Marisol Ortiz was about to start the hardest month of her adult life, though she didn't know it yet. Marisol was 29, raised in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, by a mother who'd spent 30 years cleaning office buildings at night and a father who'd driven a delivery truck 6 days a week until his knees gave out. Money had always been tight in that house, but her parents had never let tight money turn into an excuse for how they treated other people, and that lesson had settled into Marisol early and never left her. She'd studied interior design for 2 years at a community college before her mother's diagnosis changed everything. Early-stage kidney disease, the kind that didn't kill you quickly but slowly took everything you had anyway, dialysis 3 times a week, medication that wasn't fully covered, a stack of bills that arrived faster than Marisol could clear them. She'd left school to work full-time. She told herself it was temporary. For years later, it still was, in the way that things become permanent by pretending not to be. The housekeeping agency placed her at the Cross penthouse for what was supposed to be a short-term contract, extra hands needed to manage a wedding's worth of preparations. Marisol took it without hesitating, because $75 a day above her usual rate was $75 closer to her mother's next round of treatment. She didn't tell her mother where the extra money was coming from, exactly. She just said she'd picked up more hours. Most nights that first month, Marisol left the tower after 8, caught the last reliable B63 bus with enough time to make the transfer, and got home to Sunset Park with her feet aching in a way that had stopped surprising her a long time ago. She'd sit at her mother's kitchen table, eat whatever was left over from the night before, rice, maybe an egg if there was one, after a night spent plating dinners that cost more than she made in a week. She never mentioned that part to her mother either. Some things you just carry quietly, because saying them out loud doesn't make them lighter. It just makes someone else carry them too. The man who owned that penthouse was Julian Cross, sole heir to Cross Property Group, a real estate empire his grandfather had built out of a handful of Brooklyn tenements in the 1960s. By every external measure, Julian was exactly what the family name required, sharp in boardrooms, composed at galas, engaged, in 3 months, to marry Vanessa Bellamy, a woman from old Connecticut money whom his mother adored and his board had all but hand-selected. Julian noticed things other people in his position tended to overlook. And within his first 2 weeks of Marisol working in his home, he noticed her, not romantically, but the way you notice someone doing something well in a world where almost no one bothers anymore. She never rushed. She never cut a corner when no one important was in the room. She treated the smallest task like it mattered, because to her, it did. He also, slowly, began noticing something else. The first time was small enough that Julian almost let it go. He came home early one Tuesday and heard Vanessa's voice from the kitchen before he'd even set his keys down, sharp, clipped, telling Marisol to redo the flower arrangements for the second time that week. "I don't care what you think looks nice," Vanessa said. "I care what looks expensive. Try again, and don't make me ask twice." Julian stood in the hallway, unseen, and told himself it was stress. Weddings did that to people. 2 weeks later, an old friend gave him a reason to stop telling himself that. Andre Boone had known Julian since freshman year at Cornell, back before the Cross name meant anything beyond a family that owned some buildings in Brooklyn. At a birthday dinner, Andre pulled him aside near the bar and told him, carefully, that he'd watched Vanessa tear into a server at a mutual friend's dinner party over a slow drink order, loud enough that the whole table had gone quiet. Andre said he didn't want to make it a thing. He just thought Julian should know. Julian brushed it off out loud. Inside, something wouldn't sit still. So he started coming home early. Not every day, never announced. He told himself he was being paranoid, that he'd find nothing, that Andre had simply caught Vanessa on a bad night. He did not find nothing. Over the following weeks, Julian watched a pattern build that was too consistent to be coincidence, and too specific to be stress. He watched Vanessa hand Marisol a list of tasks at 9 at night, then grow irritated when Marisol, gently, mentioned she had a bus to catch. He watched her correct Marisol's English in front of a delivery driver, unprompted, unnecessary, designed to land. He watched her leave a wine glass shattered on the kitchen floor on purpose, he was almost certain, just to see how quickly it disappeared. And twice, before the night everyone would eventually hear about, he watched Vanessa humiliate Marisol in front of other people entirely on purpose. The first time was at a smaller pre-wedding lunch, for weeks out, with Julian's mother and 2 of Vanessa's bridesmaids present. Marisol had brought out a tray of pastries and, reaching to set it down, brushed her sleeve against a crystal vase, which wobbled but didn't fall. Vanessa's hand shot out and caught it, and then, in front of Eleanor Cross and both bridesmaids, she said, loudly enough for the whole table to hear, "God, be careful. Some of us can't just replace things because we broke them the last time." It wasn't even true. Marisol had never broken anything. The lie landed anyway, and Marisol simply apologized and stepped back into the kitchen, her face burning, saying nothing. Julian had been in the next room. He heard all of it. And he still said nothing, telling himself it wasn't the moment, that confronting Vanessa in front of his mother and her bridesmaids would only make things worse for Marisol, not better. He told himself a lot of things that month that, looking back, were mostly excuses for his own discomfort. The second time was worse, and quieter, and it happened only 10 days before the engagement party, the kind of cruelty that doesn't need an audience to do its damage. Vanessa found Marisol refolding towels in the linen closet and told her, flatly, without raising her voice at all, that she didn't understand why Julian insisted on people like her working so closely with the wedding, that someone from a real event staffing company would understand the standards required. She said it the way you'd comment on the weather. Marisol didn't respond. She finished the towels, closed the closet door, and walked to the small staff bathroom near the service entrance, locked it, and sat down on the closed toilet lid with her back against the wall. She didn't sob. She wasn't the type. It was quieter than that, her hands trembling slightly in her lap, one long breath in, one long breath out, her eyes wet but her jaw tight, the particular kind of crying a person does when they've had a lot of practice not doing it loudly. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist, checked it in the small mirror above the sink, and went back to work for minutes later like nothing had happened at all, because for her, functionally, nothing had. This was just Tuesday. Julian didn't see that one. Beatrice Nash did, the longtime Cross family housekeeper who'd worked in that penthouse for over a decade, and it was Beatrice who pulled Marisol aside in the pantry that same evening, speaking the way someone speaks when they've watched the same story play out with other people before. She warned Marisol that Vanessa wasn't kind to people she considered beneath her, and that the closer the wedding got, the worse it tended to get. Marisol thanked her. She said she wasn't worried. She'd dealt with worse people for less money. She'd let her work speak for itself, the way it always had. By the time Julian started asking himself seriously why he hadn't said anything yet, the guests were already RSVPing to the engagement party. He knew, by then, exactly what kind of pattern he was watching. He'd started, almost without admitting it to himself, keeping a mental list, the flower comment, the vase lie in front of his mother, the real event staffing company a line Beatrice had eventually told him about, the countless smaller moments of a door held less than fully open, eye contact withheld, a name mispronounced on purpose one too many times to be an accident. And still he said nothing directly to Vanessa. Still he told himself he was gathering more information, being careful, choosing the right moment. The truth, if he'd let himself sit with it, was simpler and less flattering. He was afraid of what ending it would mean, the disappointment on his mother's face, the board's quiet concern, the machinery of a wedding that was already 6 weeks into motion. It was easier to watch and wait than to be the one who stopped it. And every day he waited was another day Marisol absorbed something he could have stopped and didn't. The engagement party was scheduled for a Friday evening on the penthouse terrace, 200 guests, string lights, orchids flown in from Ecuador, the formal announcement of the wedding date. Vanessa threw herself into the planning with an intensity that bordered on frantic, rewriting the seating chart for times, sending back linens over half shades of ivory, growing more brittle with every passing day. Marisol bore almost all of it, lists that stretched from morning to midnight, instructions revised minutes after being given, corrections delivered in front of caterers and florists and anyone else within earshot. The night of the party arrived with the kind of golden late spring light that made the whole city look staged for the occasion. For the first hour, everything unfolded exactly as planned. Toasts were given. Photos were taken beneath the orchid arch. Julian's mother beamed at guests who told her how perfect the two of them looked together. Julian played his part, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, smiling for photographs he already suspected he wouldn't recognize himself in a year from now, but his eyes kept drifting toward the terrace doors, toward Marisol, moving between rooms with a tray balanced carefully in her hands, doing everything asked of her without a single visible complaint, the way she'd done for 3 months while he watched and waited and told himself it wasn't the moment yet. It happened fast, the way these things always do. A caterer stepped backward without looking and collided with Marisol's shoulder hard enough to send her tray tilting. 2 champagne flutes slipped and shattered against the stone, splashing across the hem of Vanessa's gown as she stood near the terrace doors mid-conversation with a photographer from a lifestyle magazine. For half a second, it looked survivable, the kind of small disaster a good hostess laughs off with a joke and a cocktail napkin. It wasn't. Vanessa spun toward Marisol so fast her own glass nearly slipped from her hand, and whatever composure she'd been performing all evening simply evaporated in front of everyone. She didn't lower her voice. She called Marisol careless, said she'd ruined the dress, ruined the night, ruined the one evening that was supposed to matter more than any other night of Vanessa's life. Marisol dropped to her knees immediately, gathering glass with shaking hands, apologizing again and again, and that should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Vanessa snatched a linen napkin off the nearest table and threw it down at Marisol's knees, ordering her to clean the champagne off the hem of the gown right there, on the floor, in front of everyone, insisting she wouldn't take a single step until it was done. And when Marisol, hands trembling, hesitated for just a moment too long, Vanessa leaned down and said the line that finally silenced the entire terrace. People like you should be grateful you're even allowed to touch a room like this. Nobody moved. The string quartet stopped mid-phrase. 200 guests who had spent the last hour laughing and clinking glasses went completely, uncomfortably still, several of them looking away, unwilling to watch, others frozen with a napkin halfway to their mouths, unsure if what they'd just heard was actually real. Julian had been standing near the terrace doorway the entire time, a glass of scotch in his hand, close enough to have heard every word and far enough that Vanessa hadn't clocked him yet. He set the glass down without looking at it and crossed the stone floor, and every guest on that terrace turned to watch him do it. He knelt beside Marisol first, not beside Vanessa, not toward the crowd, but down at eye level with the woman on her knees, and gently took the broken glass from her trembling hands before helping her to her feet. "You don't need to do that," he said, quiet enough for her alone at first. "You never needed to do that." "Julian," Vanessa started, her voice already shifting from fury toward something closer to panic, sensing, the way people sometimes do a half-second before it's confirmed, that something had just gone permanently wrong. "I watched the whole thing," Julian said, turning to her now, his voice even, carrying clearly across a terrace that had gone dead silent. "A caterer bumped into her. It was an accident. And even if it hadn't been, nobody kneels on my floor and cleans champagne off your dress in front of 200 people. Not for me. Not ever. You're embarrassing me over a housekeeper," Vanessa said, her voice climbing. No, Julian said. You did that yourself about a minute ago. I just finally stopped pretending I didn't see it. And then he didn't stop there, the way he had every other time. This time he said all of it. He told her about the flower arrangement comment 3 weeks ago, in the kitchen. He told her about the lunch with his mother, the vase that never actually fell, the lie about Marisol breaking things that had never been broken. He told her, in front of Eleanor Cross herself, that Beatrice had come to him about the linen closet, about people like hers and real event staffing, and that he should have said something that same night instead of waiting 10 more days to hear it repeated. He told her about the 9 o'clock task lists, the bus she nearly missed twice, the correction of her English in front of a stranger holding a food delivery bag. He laid it out piece by piece, receipt after receipt, not as an accusation thrown in anger, but as a pattern finally spoken out loud after months of being catalogued in silence. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, he said, and his voice, for the first time all evening, wavered slightly. That everyone has bad days. But this isn't a bad day, Vanessa. I've watched you do this for 3 months, and I let it happen because saying something felt harder than staying quiet. That's on me. But it ends tonight. Vanessa's mouth opened, something about standards, about how hard she'd worked to make the night perfect, but the words came out thin, without the command they'd carried minutes earlier. The image she had spent her whole life constructing had cracked in front of the exact audience she'd built the evening to impress, and there was no smoothing it back into place this time. Julian reached into his jacket pocket, where the ring box meant for tonight's official announcement had been sitting since morning, and set it down on the nearest table. Not thrown. Not slammed. Just set down, quiet and final. I can't marry someone who treats people like this when she thinks it costs her nothing, he said. I should have ended this the first time I saw it. I'm sorry it took this long. I'm not sorry it's ending now. Vanessa left the penthouse that night without her jacket, without finishing her champagne, without the composure she had spent a lifetime perfecting. Within days, a society columnist who'd been standing near the terrace doors wrote a brief, carefully worded item about what 200 guests had witnessed, and the story took on a life of its own the way these things do in a city that's small at the top. Wedding invitations required an awkward, humiliating round of cancellation notices. Business associates connected to the Bellamy family's investment firm quietly began pulling back. Friends who had surrounded Vanessa for the access she provided stopped returning her calls, one by one, over the following months. She learned, in the most public way possible, that the way a person treats someone who can offer them nothing tends to say more about them than anything they've ever achieved. For Marisol, the days that followed unfolded very differently. Julian checked on her personally the next morning, not out of obligation, but because the discomfort of having watched and waited for 3 months hadn't left him overnight. He apologized plainly, without excuses, for taking so long to act, for the lunch with his mother he'd overheard and said nothing about, for every day he'd told himself it wasn't the right moment yet. Marisol, for her part, told him honestly that she hadn't expected an apology at all, and that she hadn't needed rescuing so much as she'd needed someone to finally see clearly what had been happening in front of them the whole time. Learning that she'd studied interior design before her mother's illness pulled her out of school, Julian offered her a position within Cross Property Group's Design and Renovations division, real compensation, real title, a role built around the thing she'd actually trained for instead of the thing circumstance had forced on her. Marisol accepted carefully, half expecting the offer to evaporate once the emotion of that night wore off. It didn't. 3 months later, she stood in front of a small nameplate outside a shared office on the 11th floor of Cross Property Group's headquarters, Marisol Ortiz, Design and Renovations, and ran her thumb across the raised lettering longer than she probably needed to. That evening, she brought her mother to see it, walking her slowly through the lobby in her good coat, and watched her mother reach out and touch the nameplate the same way Marisol had that morning, then press a hand briefly over her mouth, blinking fast, saying nothing for almost a full minute. It was the first time in 4 years Marisol had seen her cry from something other than pain, and it lasted exactly as long as it needed to before her mother laughed, wiped her face, and told her, in Spanish, that her father would have been unbearable about this. He'd have told the whole block by Sunday. As for Vanessa, her fall from Manhattan's good graces extended well beyond that single evening, stretching into years of quietly closed doors and a reputation that never fully recovered. It would take her a long time, those who knew her later said, to understand that the version of herself she'd built so carefully had never actually been strong. It had simply never been tested in front of people who mattered until it was, and it hadn't survived the test. Months after the party, at a small dinner cross-property group hosted to celebrate the completion of a renovated building in Chelsea, Marisol arrived not as staff, but as the project lead responsible for its design. She and Julian found themselves talking long after most of the other guests had left, the conversation moving easily, without the weight of titles sitting between them the way it once had. What had started as quiet respect, observed from a careful distance for 3 uncomfortable months, had slowly become something neither of them had planned for. It wasn't built on the drama of one terrace, one broken glass, one public reckoning. It grew the way real things tend to grow, slower, steadier, rooted in something that had already been tested and hadn't broken. The truth is, character always shows itself eventually, usually in the smallest, least guarded moments, the ones a person assumes no one important is watching. Wealth can buy the right flowers, the right linens, the right photographer for the right angle. It can't buy the kind of dignity Marisol carried on her knees on cold stone, in front of 200 strangers, when she had every reason in the world to stop carrying it and didn't. If this story meant something to you, think about what you would have done if you'd been standing on that terrace. Would you have spoken up, or stayed quiet like most of the room did? Let us know in the comments below, and if this one hit you, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one. There are more stories like this waiting for you, stories about quiet strength, real justice, and the moments that change everything. We'll see you in the next video.